Balancing the Books, woohoo! Everyone's favourite game, or at least my favourite game. This is the game where I add up everything that came onto my TBR with everything that went off my TBR and try to balance those numbers. And I have to say, I hit the motherload this month with reading so many really good books and a few slightly Strangeville ones. It did help having 2 readathons this month in terms of helping me read a lot. And of course, our current situation, the fact we've basically been put in a room and had the doors taken away, so we have no option but to read a lot, live my best couch potato life. But it's also been a really hot hot month, which means that I've done a lot of being unleashed into the garden to read there, so I'm still feeling so lucky about where I'm staying right now. But with that, let's play Balancing the Books. So at the end of last month, I finished with 45 books on my TBR, which was a bit of a jump up from the month before, but as I said, I've read quite a lot this month, though they weren't all ones I already owned, so I think that number should have come down. Fingers crossed. The very first thing that happened in April was unfortunately a DNF. I DNF'd Charlotte by Helen Moffett. So I had been very kindly sent this one. I was so excited and I'm so grateful for it. And it's not really a criticism of the book why I DNF'd it. It just... Historical fiction isn't really my area, so I absolutely love reading classics. I love reading Jane Austen's original books, and I did really enjoy recently The Other Bennet Sister. That one was by Janice Hadlow, and it was another Pride and Prejudice retelling, which is what this is, but that one followed Mary Bennet. And I think the reason I was able to like that one so much is that so much of the book overlapped with the story of Pride and Prejudice. So it was just like a retelling of that story that I already love from a different perspective and making me feel differently about those characters, and that was really cool. Whereas this one is about Charlotte Lucas, but this book is set entirely after the events of Pride and Prejudice, or almost entirely, and actually the kind of flashback sections where it covers some of the same ground as Pride and Prej were my favourite sections. That was the bit I enjoyed, because outside of that, it just becomes a historical fiction novel about a character who's called Charlotte Lucas, but other than that, it doesn't really bear that much relevance to Pride and Prejudice, just with some of the same character names. So I wasn't loving it. I do think it also wasn't helped that I started reading this when we'd just come down here, like lockdown had just started, so I was just feeling a bit unsettled, and I think that didn't help. Another time I might have got into this one a lot more. And then the next thing that I did was read 10 whole books in one day. Unfortunately, that doesn't count for my TBR at all because I had to buy these books especially. In fact, I had to buy 2 sets of them so that me and Soph could read at the same time. So these are not in the right order because I just dropped them on the floor literally just before filming this. But these are the Georgia Nicholson series, Angus, Thongs and Full-Frontal Snogging, etc. And my sister and I read all of these in 24 hours. So I will link to that video. It was a lot of fun. That does absolutely nothing to my TBR, but it was a fun experience. Almost everything from this point onwards you have seen me read in my Owls vlogs, but here's my like proper summaries of them. So next I read The Sin Eater by Megan Campisi, and this, having just said I didn't like historical fiction, this was a historical fiction that I really enjoyed and gave 4 stars. But I definitely did read this one slower than I usually read, I think because the genre is so outside my comfort zone, so I think that slowed me down, but it was really clever. So this was roughly based on the idea of sin eaters, which were real historical people, but I don't think we know that much about them other than that they would ritually eat foods after somebody had died to absolve their sins, and then the person who died could get into heaven. So Megan Campisi takes this idea and runs with it. So she's invented this whole world where there's different foods represent different sins, and this is set in essentially Elizabethan times, but it is this alternate version of reality. So instead of Queen Elizabeth, they have Queen Bethany, whose sister was called Queen Maris, and they had a father who had 6 wives. So it's like definitely that world, but with some creative license. And this is like a conspiracy thriller set in that world, and it was so clever. So our main character is a sin eater. She is punished at the beginning for stealing a loaf of bread, and her punishment is that she's sentenced to be a sin eater. So that means that for basically the whole of the book, she's not allowed to speak, people can't speak to her. So she has to solve this mystery while not being able to really communicate with anyone, which was so clever. And I would have thought that reading a book where there can be like no dialogue from the main character would get boring, but it really worked. And I also just loved the whole conspiracy. It kind of reminded me a bit of the Da Vinci Code, which I know is a book people make fun of, but I loved that book when I read it as a teenager, and this had some of that element of kind of uncovering symbols that were embroidered into tapestries and stuff. It was a really good fun one. So even if you don't like historical fiction, I'm with you. I still think this one's worth a try. Then my Patreons recommended I read The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa, and I am so glad I did, so thanks Patreons. This was my first 5-star read of the month. I absolutely loved it. So this is about a housekeeper who, we never learn her name, becomes the cleaner for this professor. Again, we never learn his name, he's just the professor. But he has, after having had a car accident, I think, I had a brain injury, he only has 80 minutes of memory at a time. So every morning when she arrives for work, he doesn't remember her, but he has all of these little post-its that he like clips to his suit with reminders and little pictures that he draws, and that's how he kind of gets through his days. And he's this maths genius, so he spends his days holed up in his office solving maths problems and then like sending them off to newspapers for competitions and stuff. And our housekeeper main character kind of becomes really interested in maths, and she starts learning from him and kind of discovers the beauty of maths. So this book combined two of my favourite tropes, one memory loss and the other books about maths. Turns out that's a thing I love. And also combine them in such a wonderful way. It reminded me of the Mean Girls quote where Katie says that she loves maths because it's the same in every language, and this was kind of like that. So because of the professor's short-term memory, he can't bond with the housekeeper in the same way that we are used to people bonding, in the same way we're used to people communicating. And yet they do have this really strong, powerful relationship. You just have to rethink a bit about how relationships work, and maths is a massive part of that. So she learns to really love talking to him about maths and learning maths from him, and it's almost this form of communication and love between them. The housekeeper also has a young boy who comes with her to the professor's house every day, and the relationship between the professor and the boy is even more moving. This book was so moving and so sad and beautiful. I already want to read it again, and I definitely want to read more by Yoko Ogawa. This is my first of her books, but she also wrote The Memory Police, which is quite popular at the moment, and she apparently has won every major Japanese literary award there is, so I'm a big fan of her already. But then I did some book hauling. So I thought that I just wasn't going to haul anything while I was here, because usually a lot of my downfall with hauling comes from me bringing books home from the office, but right now we're all stuck at home. But I hadn't considered NetGalley, and I've suddenly been on like a NetGalley binge. So all the books I hauled. So first I hauled a non-fiction book called Sex, Robots and Vegan Meat by Jenny Kleeman. I did basically just get that one because of the title, but it sounds really interesting. It's kind of exploring various things that may become like really key in the future and that are already kind of here. So it's just like a real life Black Mirror, but I don't think negative, so not like Black Mirror at all. Then I hauled a book called Breasts and Eggs by Meiko Kawakami. So this one is a novel translated from Japanese. I have had such a roll with loving all of the books I've read recently translated from Japanese. I mean, not that that suggests that that would continue, because they're obviously all different, but I have had a lucky streak, so seeing if that'll keep going. And this book is about the lives of 3 different women, 2 adult sisters, and then one of them has a daughter. And I think the title kind of comes from one of them has breast cancer, and then we have a storyline kind of 10 years later that's about fertility. So I think it's just about exploring womanhood. Then I hauled The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. Very excited because I love her, and this one, perfect timing, this is about the 1918 flu. Obviously she must have been writing this one so much before it became so relevant, but I really want to read this one. Emma Donoghue is brilliant. I actually still have 2 books of hers still on my TBR, so I need to work my way through them, but I'll probably just skip straight ahead to this one, to be honest, because it sounds so perfect for right now. Especially because it is supposed to be like a hopeful story rather than, I feel like dystopians about possible future pandemics are quite scary to read right now, whereas this is a historical novel. God, I said it like historical fiction and I just keep talking about them. So it's like a hopeful story of a tragedy that happened in the past, which I think will be easier to read because it's more like, while it was a tragedy, we got through it. Like, humanity survived through this before. And then one more from NetGalley, I got You Will Never Be Forgotten by Mary South, which is a collection of short stories. I'm trying to experiment with reading more short story collections because often I find them hard to engage with, but every now and then I find a collection that I just absolutely love. I loved Salt Slow by Juliet Armfield. I loved Hot Little Hands by Abigail Ullman, I think is her name. So this one sounded great. This one sounds more Black Mirror-esque. All of the stories in the collection are about people using technology in order to help them through some emotion or kind of escape from themselves. So it sounds quite sad and dark and yeah, really intriguing. And then finally, I hauled one more, but this wasn't NetGalley. I got this one from Hive, which by the way, you should definitely be using. So Hive is a website where you can order books, but the money supports independent bookshops. So consider it. It's great. I love it. You can also select when you're buying a particular bookshop you want your purchase to support, which is really, really cool. So from Hive, I got Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. This one was for my book club that I just had with my friends, and then I read it. And I really enjoyed this one. This is about a woman basically my age, a little bit younger, called Queenie, who is essentially going through a mental breakdown. So it's quite hard to read because her behaviour throughout the book and the decisions that she makes are so frustrating, and you watch her being like so awful to her friends who are trying to support her, but at the same time you're so with her, you so empathise because she's going through these really terrible things, and slowly throughout the book more and more is drip fed to you about her past and about why this is happening to her. So my favourite bits really were her relationship with her family, that you kind of slowly get to know. Like, she has this younger cousin who's like a bit of a too cool teenager. They don't get along that well, but then actually is this really like lovely young girl who is really supportive to her. And then even more moving, her relationship with her grandparents, who are like very old-fashioned and don't approve of therapy, but kind of go out of their way to learn to understand her. So those are my favourite bits. But overall, like, I liked the book but didn't love it. But then when we had our book club, we had our virtual book club over Zoom, we talked for so long about it, and it made me feel like I almost liked it more because there was so much in here that was so interesting. And I think in terms of reading about an experience of a woman whose life is different from mine, this was amazing and so valuable. It was what we were all saying in the group, and my book club, just full disclosure, we are all white women, and we were saying in it that yes, we talk about racism, we know about racism, we've read quite a few books on race, like Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, so we're aware of this, but actually reading this book that kind of takes you through the days in the life of a black woman in London, it's so unrelenting what she has to face, the treatment that she gets from other people, the look she gets from other people, even kind of explaining what it's like feeling displaced from areas like Brixton, which have been really gentrified. It just really kind of hammered it home to us how much we get away with and how much we don't have to experience about being a woman of colour. There were also some really funny moments, especially like text messages that you read of hers. I really did actually enjoy this book a lot, and I read it really fast. After that, I read The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne, and this was my next 5-star read of the month. And this is a book that my family have been telling me to read for so long. They've all read it, all loved it. And do you ever get sometimes when so many people tell you you'll love a book that you actually find yourself not wanting to pick it up because it's almost like nerve-wracking, what if you don't like it as much as you're supposed to? So I think I've been kind of putting it off a bit, but I did read it this month and they were right. It is every bit as good as I thought, and it was really different from what I'd expected. From their description, I thought this was going to be a really sad book, which I think was another reason I'd slightly been putting it off. I thought it was going to be a kind of a Little Life-esque book. What I wasn't expecting is that this book is hilarious. So very sad things happen. If you wrote like this guy's life down on paper, it's heartbreaking, but the whole book is bitingly funny. The main character is really funny. He's just like properly witty. The characters around him are so funny, often from being so ridiculous. Like, his adoptive parents are so awful. They're like caricatures, but they're so brilliant to read. And yeah, I just loved it. I love that kind of thing, that kind of dark humour, gallows humour that makes you so emotional, but you can kind of cope with the emotion because it keeps making you laugh, which is definitely how I cope with emotion in my real life as well. It's just laugh right through it. So I absolutely loved this. I haven't told you what it's about. Should I tell you what it's about? It's about a main character called Cyril, who is a young gay Irish man, and it's about his whole life. We check in every 7 years and see him at different stages of his life, and that's basically what it's about. From a very young age, he falls in love with his best friend. We see how that plays out. We see his experience of coming out. He moves around a bit, so he lives in Ireland and then he lives in Amsterdam and then New York, and so we kind of experience a bit of the attitudes towards gay people in those different countries and also in the different decades that he lives in them. So he's in New York during the AIDS crisis, and there's like a lot of homophobia there. Yeah, I loved it. It was brilliant. Would read it again. Then I read another 5-star read, which was The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. So she is the author of Station 11, which is a really popular book about a flu pandemic, which is very eerily similar to the one we're going through right now. And I liked that book. That one's a few years old, but I liked The Glass Hotel so much more. It's a very, very strange book. It's going to be hard to even explain what it's about, but I will try right now. So our main characters in this book are a brother and a sister. Vincent, who's the sister, unusual name for a woman, but quite cool, and her brother Paul, or half-brother Paul, who's a bit older. And they don't spend that much like screen time, page time together in the book. They have a very difficult relationship. But we follow each of them in their lives and the places where they overlap. So there's kind of a few moments in their lives where they overlap. One is when Vincent is a teenager and Paul, the brother, has to come home to look after her for a bit after her mother goes missing. Later on, when they're a little bit older, they work together at the same Glass Hotel, which is this like luxury high-end hotel right in the middle of nowhere on the water's edge. I think that's the last time they actually overlap in person. Paul is this really troubled character. Vincent ends up becoming the kind of trophy girlfriend of this very wealthy client who visits the hotel while she's working there. So then we follow her going off and living this sort of life of luxury, but we know from the beginning that the man that she is the trophy girlfriend for is going to end up in prison, so we see what plays out there. It's very non-linear, this book. We know that later on after this, at some point, she's going to end up on this cruise ship. So we flash back and forth a lot. We flash back and forth into not quite parallel universes, but one of the characters has visions of this counter life where if he'd made different decisions, life would have been different. And some of those things almost come true. It's like it's not just in his imagination, it's like he's kind of seeing into this almost real counter life. So it's like little elements of supernatural, even though it's not a supernatural book. It's just a weird book, a really, really weird book, but I genuinely loved it. Then, still going strong, I read If I Can't Have You by Charlotte Levin. So this one is kind of the female you. This is about a woman who meets this guy and becomes obsessed with him. And to begin with, it's quite relatable of things like, you know, she just becomes a little bit obsessed with this guy and kind of reads into things from him and slightly like manufacturing times for them to bump into each other. So when she overhears he's going to be at a certain pub, like she makes plans to be at that pub. So it's like, you know, not great decisions, but you've kind of, even if you haven't done those things, most people have kind of considered doing those things, but she sort of just spirals into a place that you're like, what are you doing? She's the worst decision maker in the world. But it's so much more complex than that synopsis makes it sound. So she's not a crazy stalker. She's not the kind of stereotype of this crazy girl. The guy is awful. The guy is a gaslighter, he's manipulative, he does this to other women. So he absolutely is terrible in this. So you're frustrated at her for even like not seeing how terrible he is, but that is not her fault at all. And we also learn a lot about her past, and she is troubled. She has lived through some pretty traumatic events which have really affected her. It ended up being a really sad book, but like really, really page turning. Really recommend. Great fun. Am I still going? Yes, I am. Then I read Summerwater by Sarah Moss. So this one is all told over 24 hours, and it's set in this like Scottish holiday park where people have these little wooden cabins that some of them own them as their summer houses and some of them rent them. And we go between the different characters in that day who are at this park, but you only spend like one chapter in each character and then you're done, you move on. So it's almost like a collection of short stories. I said that in my Owls vlog. It felt more like a collection of short stories that vaguely overlap, but they do all have this sense of foreboding, and we keep getting hints that something tragic is going to happen by the end of that day. So you're sort of guessing the whole time what's going to happen, and it builds up to this really dramatic conclusion. And the writing in this book was absolutely beautiful. The character studies were so in-depth. So each story, you felt like you knew that person inside out, and each of them had very real thoughts and very real feelings, but also each of them had their own kind of prejudices. Each of them were very flawed people who you felt uncomfortable being inside their heads sometimes. And the book feels very much like a response to Brexit and the attitudes that have been allowed to spring up in this country ever since then. So all of that I absolutely loved. It's just that, as I was saying, I often struggle with short story collections. I kind of wanted to return back to some of the characters that I'd already met rather than moving on so many times. That would have made it a less good book, to be honest. Like, the book as it was perfect. It's so well crafted, it's so beautifully written. It's just personally like not my favourite kind of thing. And then finally, I read 3 books from Scribd, so these do nothing to my TBR score. The first one was Through the Woods, which is a graphic novel by Emily Carroll, which is like a horror fairy tale graphic novel, really, really creepy. I didn't really understand the stories. Like, whenever they got to the end, I was like, I don't understand what just happened. So I only gave it a 3 stars, but in terms of the eeriness and the drawings, like absolutely amazing. I'd love to see more from Emily Carroll and kind of see if I get on better with some of her other stories, because I just wasn't quite sure what these were telling me. Then I also read More Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops by Jen Campbell. So this is the sequel to Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops, which basically, when Jen Campbell used to work in this bookshop ripping yarns, she had a blog at the time and she would write down like some of the funniest things customers said. So this is just a collection of more of those quotes. So they are so funny and so ridiculous. People are just so stupid sometimes, or like so outrageous in their demands. And then finally I also read on script Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. This one I also gave a 3. It was kind of just going down to 3s at the end of the month, which was a shame after such a strong start. It was fun though. I liked the movie of this, which is why I wanted to read it. This is about 3 sets of sisters. They're these 2 older sisters, the aunts, who are witches, who like practice witchcraft. We don't know that much about them in this book, but there is a prequel that I'm going to read soon about them. Then we have Sally and Gillian Owens, who are the main sisters of this story. Sally is Sandra Bullock in the film, and she's like very sensible, and she gets married and has this very normal life, and then her husband dies and she's just like totally kind of goes into grief after that, and then like will never love again. And then there's Gillian, the younger sister, who is Nicole Kidman in the movie, who is like wild and crazy, and she gets married loads of times and falls in love loads of times. Men fall in love with her wherever she goes, and she like gets bored of them so quickly and moves on, and she just like travels around place to place. It's really irresponsible. And the relationship between these 2 sisters is quite difficult, but I loved the sister bonds that they have underneath it. And then we also have Sally's children, Antonia and Kylie, who also have a very difficult sister relationship. Also are like chalk and cheese, but there's also a really strong bond there. So that was my favourite thing about the book, is like these 3 pairs of sisters and the bonds that they have. I also really liked the almost like backgroundness of the witchcraft. It's almost like the witchcraft and the magic is more a mood rather than a key part to the story, but weird things happen throughout the book. Like constantly strange supernatural things are happening in the background almost. It was a very bizarre book. I don't know why I didn't like it more, because it was very interesting and cool, but I didn't quite get where the plot was going. Sometimes it was a little bit meandering, and yeah, I felt like it could have had a little bit more structure to it. I'm out of breath from telling you about all of those, but I am done now. So that means I finished on 42 books on my TBR, so I have balanced the books and even reduced the books from last month, so that's good. Hopefully that trend will continue. I will try not to go on another NetGalley binge. So if you want to see my reactions while I was reading basically everything I've just mentioned, all of my Owls vlogs are linked below, so you can go and watch me while I read those. And do let me know in the comments what you've read this month, what have your favourites been, anything you would recommend. See you next time!